Welcome to the Afghanistan Project podcast. I'm Beth Bailey, and I'm happy to introduce today's guests, Sonia Norton and Daniel Salazar. We'll be talking about the decision announced on April 11th through the New York Times that the Trump administration terminated temporary protected status for our Afghan allies on March 21st. Glad to have you guys here, and I'd love to do some introductions for you because you both have really incredible resumes. Sonia Norton is the Director of Advocacy at No One Left Behind. Before joining No One Left Behind, she worked in the House of Representatives for 5 years with members of the House Committees on Armed Services, Judiciary, and Ways and Means. Most recently, she served as the Senior Legislative Assistant for Representative Earl Blumenauer, where she led a policy portfolio including Afghan allies, foreign affairs, and judiciary issues. In that role, Sonia was the lead House Democratic staffer for the introduction of the Afghan Adjustment Act and was named one of the top 10 policy staff to watch. Sonia has also served as a Fulbright-Nehru English teaching assistant and was elected for 3 terms on the Women's Congressional Staff Association Board. Daniel Salazar is a refugee and protection policy advisor at Global Refuge, the National Refugee Resettlement Agency formerly known as Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. He does policy and advocacy work on the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, Afghan and Ukrainian resettlement, and other topics. He's worked on Afghan-related legislation such as the Afghan Adjustment Act, the Afghan SIV program, and care authorization since July 2022. First at U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and now at Global Refuge. He's also a coalition member of Evacuate Our Allies and has helped campaigns on temporary protected status for Afghanistan and reparole for Afghans. Before this work, he was a journalist in Kansas and Texas before moving to Washington, D.C. for his master's in foreign service at Georgetown University. You guys are really impressive, and I'm so honored to have you here today to talk about this little understood and complicated topic.
Yeah, thrilled to be here. Thanks for having us. And yeah, I wish it were under better circumstances, but glad to have the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, me too. I wish it were better circumstances. I had all this content planned of like great stories, and then January happened, and now it's just like one disaster after another. So let's start with what is TPS. And Daniel, I'm going to let you take that one because this is something that we talk about SIV here, we talk about US RAP here, we talk about all of these HP, but TPS is something that I don't think really comes up on the podcast very often.
Yes, that's definitely the case. So, just to cover, some of its background, temporary protected status, or TPS. It's a protection. It's a form of immigration relief that's part of federal immigration law. It was created by Congress in 1990. It is important to clarify that it's not a pathway, the way that we may talk about U.S. Refugee Admissions Program or the SIV program. So it's only for those who are already here in the United States. So you can't apply to get TPS if you're outside the country. It's only a status you can acquire and be eligible for if you're within the United States and have been here. So it's a temporary status that's afforded to certain foreign nationals from certain countries that are being affected by conflict, disasters, or other extraordinary conditions that affect the ability to safely return. So in short, TPS is meant to prevent the removal of individuals who are from countries that are experiencing crises. So it provides protection from deportation or removal. It also provides access to work authorization, although you only get that after you get the actual underlying status through TPS. The government makes decisions of which countries qualify for the program. They're called designations. And the government also sets the eligibility requirements of who gets to be eligible or a beneficiary of the status. And it's one that you have to apply for. So, so countries designations are created for countries that are in war, whether it's Ukraine with its current war or civil conflicts in Sudan and Burma, disasters, so when countries have had earthquakes, like Haiti in 2010 or Nepal in 2015, there were TPS designations there, as well as hurricanes in kind of more the Central American context. And then also there's a provision for countries that are experiencing other extraordinary or temporary conditions that affect safe returns. So that's kind of a catch-all for countries that are in various sorts of humanitarian crises, often ones that are connected with conflicts, whether it's Syria or Somalia or Yemen, these countries that have kind of had conflict or fragility be a part of their modern history. So it is also worth noting too that TPS by its name, it's limited in time. The designations are only granted in periods of 6, 12, or 18 months. And the whole process basically involves the federal government, specifically the Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, running this process where it considers which designations or what to do with the designation that's coming up for its expiration. So the Secretary can extend the protections for those who are already on TPS. It can redesignate. It can create a new cutoff date for new individuals who've more recently arrived to be covered, or it can choose to terminate it, to essentially wind down the program and say that no new individuals can register or continue to benefit from the designation.
Very interesting. Sonia, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think just definitely want to foot stomp that it is, by its name, temporary protected status to address these extraordinary circumstances like we've seen in Afghanistan since the fall in 21 and the withdrawal of the U.S. forces, that it's clearly not a safe place for Afghan nationals, particularly with a U.S. connection or especially a U.S. military connection, to return to. And that's where Afghanistan is just like a quintessential example of what TPS was designed to do and why Congress stood up a program like this.
Absolutely. I'd love to know if either of you can answer this. Has TPS ever been so abruptly removed? A few weeks ago, yes, for I think Venezuelans and some other countries. But I mean, prior to this administration, did we ever see TPS just get pulled so quickly?
So I would say that to walk through kind of what the New York Times report talks about. So the current TPS designation for Afghanistan, it was made in late 2023 by then Secretary Mayorkas. It covers a period from about November 21st of 2023 through May 20th of this year. So it was the full kind of 18-month designation. It's worth noting, even when a designation is 18 months, functionally it's of use and helpful, like a little more limited than that, right? Because often people will apply and won't hear back for 6, 12 months, 6, 9, 12 months. And then they have to apply for work authorization after that. So sometimes even with how temporary it is, it gets kind of, the purpose of it gets undermined a little bit by current processing times. But through the work of civil society and other partners, there was a designation originally in 2022 and that I mentioned that was then re-designated in 2023. So the current designation we have is going through May 20th of 2025, next month. By statute, DHS is supposed to reach a decision at least 60 days before that. That's kind of the timeline that federal law talks about the review to occur. Departments of Homeland Security, secretaries of Homeland Security can review it as they choose based on country conditions, but the traditional kind of schedule involves that 60-day mark. So the New York Times reported that Secretary Noem had reached that decision on March 21st to terminate the designation. So meaning that when we hit May 20th, going into May 21st, that it will, under the current policy and the way things are going, the designation will expire and not be renewed. The questions that we're kind of facing is whether that decision was communicated at all, because we've been kind of operating under the last few weeks as if there hadn't been a decision, which is also covered in federal law. Federal law talks about if there isn't a decision by that 60-day mark, then it's just automatically extended 6 months. And so Sonia, myself, other people in coalition hadn't really heard formally from the Department of Homeland Security when the 21st passed and we didn't see a decision. We weren't entirely sure what that meant, but that under statute, that should hypothetically mean a 6 month extension. So the last 24 hours have kind of been unpacking the news related from the New York Times, as well as the tidbit about the fact that this decision was reached a few weeks ago.
Yeah, that jives with one of my sources who said, are you hearing that TPS is going to get renewed like 24 hours before this dropped? And I thought, oh my gosh, that's amazing. What? And then the next morning, that was like a giant balloon that just exploded. Sonia, you talked about the political climate. Well, you've talked about the climate in Afghanistan. And so my question is, and I've seen very few people have asked the Trump administration, I think, what their position towards the Taliban is, because it almost seems like they're cozying up to them in some ways. We removed the bounty off Siraj Haqqani's head. We worked closely to get our Americans out of their custody. But I did ask the Trump administration, what are we recognizing the Taliban? The Taliban went as far as to say, we would like you to hand over the embassy in DC, and we would like you to reoccupy the one in Kabul. And so I asked state, are you going to do this? And they said, absolutely not. And I asked the NSC, are we going to do this? And they said, we've made no commitments. And so the Trump administration at least is saying that they're not recognizing the Taliban, which to me would mean that they know just how bad the Taliban is, and that we can't, be seen to partner with a group that is, committing gender apartheid against 50% of its population. So my question for you then, Sonia, is why then would we send people back when we know that the girls that we're sending back will never be educated beyond the 6th grade under the Taliban and things of that nature? And that according to the Lawler letter, Representative Lawler's letter to the Trump administration, saying that 3,200 Afghans, allies, have been killed by the Taliban and are documented as having been killed. Why do you think that the administration right now has decided that this is the time to end TPS?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the huge gaps in statements or pieces of the statement that we take issue with. It's just glaringly wrong that Afghanistan no longer meets the statutory requirements for TPS. And we know that they're getting a lot of pressure from some of their kind of closest allies and further right, frankly, members of Congress and constituents that have argued that TPS is more permanent than it is supposed to be, that it's being used to bring people in by Democratic administrations who shouldn't be here. And I think that it's getting caught up in a lot of pushback from Congress when really like you said, conditions in Afghanistan have only gotten worse. We know that people face the deadly retribution that getting off a plane from having fled to the United States with that pursuit of safety. And for many of folks, we know in the SIV pipeline, there are folks who left in extremely chaotic and just unimaginable circumstances to get to the U.S. and as a result don't have the documentation that they earned, showing their service, showing their connection to the United States. And so their SIV processing is taking a really long time, and removing TPS is, I think, a harmful political response to real situations on the ground, and it takes away a level of certainty and a level of protection that Congress intended for circumstances like this, and that directly impacts and has been important for those allies who served the U.S. and now are facing just one more layer of uncertainty while they go through an extremely long process because of a lot of the failures that happened during the withdrawal.
It's so devastating to see that. I know. Daniel, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, just on the kind of the calculus of it, there's been this narrative which Sonia has referenced that TPS essentially has been overused and has been used to create kind of these ceaseless renewals and countries long remaining on temporary protected status, and also kind of conflating it with an illegal status as well. We saw that a bit last fall. But to clarify, again, it's in statute. It's been used by Republican and Democratic administrations. The first Trump administration repeatedly extended other designations, whether it was Haiti, whether it was Syria, Yemen. Certain designations were extended. They weren't redesignated, but they were extended. So even then, they kind of recognized the value of it. The Biden administration had been pretty aggressive on TPS in terms of creating new designations for Ukraine, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Cameroon is another one that was mentioned yesterday. Burma, and Lebanon. It also traditionally tended to extend and redesignate the full 18 months. That said, even from on the other side, from advocates, there were multiple missed opportunities. There's other countries such as Mauritania or Mali or the Democratic Republic of the Congo with large diaspora communities here in the United States who've long said that they also qualify for TPS, and the Biden administration didn't heed those calls. They didn't redesignate the Ukraine designation as they were leaving, which has huge ramifications for Ukrainian parolees who've arrived more recently and they can't qualify. So it's kind of a mixed record, and I think it's to kind of qualify it as it's been overused, I think is a little, simplifying it. And even if that were the case, the idea of overuse, the idea of like endless renewals is not the case with Afghanistan. It was created in 2022, the designation, and it's only been redesignated once. It's not one of those. It's not been on the books for decades. Not to say anything about those designations, but on its own, when we're talking about Afghanistan, this is, as Sonia said, this clearly meets the statutory bounds of a country affected by conflict, disasters, and other extraordinary conditions. So, all in all, I mean, it really just feels like a policy failure because there's no other way to kind of characterize country conditions in Afghanistan, both those that were present in 2023 when they were last reviewing this, and now. The events that have happened over the last 18 months have continued to reiterate that country conditions in Afghanistan are not safe for voluntary returns of any sort, and therefore TPS should really remain. And so it's a policy failure. It feels like a procedural failure with what I talked about earlier in the March 21st deadline, and above all, it's a moral failure because the idea of sending folks in the evacuation, folks who've applied for asylum and SIVs and their children, which is primarily, from what we understand, those who have been granted TPS, taking a layer of protection away from those individuals is pretty unconscionable. You know what you know the word.
Awful all around.
It is terrible. And I'd like to add just a couple more atmospherics about what is, the 3,200 figure. Those are the people who we know have been killed. What about all of the allies who have been imprisoned by the Taliban? What about all of the ones, the fact that madrasas are replacing schools throughout Afghanistan, and so the boys who are able to go to school are being taught in the way that the Taliban wants to teach them, which is just frightening. It should frighten us because that's how the Taliban came to be, is through that madrasa system that, made them so intent on this very... it's a hateful ideology, and it has seen Afghanistan just falter and fail. You're losing so much economic potential from women. They don't respect the fact that, childbirth is a dangerous process and should be attended by trained midwives and nurses. And, it's bad. It's so bad. And my heart just breaks for people who have this and now face this uncertainty. I'd love to talk about who does have this. So, Sonia, or I guess Daniel, it's your turn to start now. So, how many Afghans got TPS initially, and how did they, what happened that made them need TPS?
Sure. So from a numbers standpoint, we know that there are thousands of Afghan beneficiaries of TPS. It's not by any means the largest designation, nor the smallest. There are a couple designations that have a few hundred. There's some, such as Haiti and Venezuela, that have hundreds of thousands. Afghanistan, from our kind of estimates, has somewhere in the range of 9, 10, or 12,000 beneficiaries, depending on what date you're looking at, whether it's the end of the fiscal year, last September, or more recently in January. At least from kind of, I maybe can speak to those who were kind of applying for it during the first designation, when it was first rolled out in the spring of 2022. From my perspective, a lot of where kind of my initial work in this had to do with kind of a very niche moment for the parole population that came through the NEO. After folks had been here on parole for about a year and a half, those who arrived in July, August, and September of 2021 were typically granted 2 years of parole, which meant that their 2-year parole periods went through July, August, September of 2023. So as we went into the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023, there is an increasing kind of concern about what kind of the end game for parole was. A lot of people hadn't secured a more permanent status. There were questions about, what exactly is the game plan to make sure that folks can stay in status? Should we hit the summer and, folks' parole runs out? So there was kind of a more kind of dedicated push among legal service providers to get clients on parole connected to TPS. I can at least speak to like the resettlement agency I worked for, one of the affiliates in California. That spring went really, really hard on like, okay, we're going to do TPS clinics for folks. It helps that TPS is relatively, in the not as an immigration attorney, but in the grand scheme of things, is relatively straightforward to apply for. There's a nationality requirement. There is a requirement about demonstrating you've been here physically, you've resided in the United States. It's a different bar than trying to apply for asylum, right, where you're demonstrating a well-founded fear of persecution. It's certainly a different bar than the SIV program and demonstrating, your eligibility and service. So there's the idea that, TPS was a good option for folks on parole with the uncertainty of the future of parole. There was a re-parole process that was rolled out in the summer of 2023 where folks could re-up their parole. Folks could get their parole extended another 2 years automatically if they had already applied for something more permanent. So there were eventually efforts from the government to make sure that OAW parolees stayed in status, but TPS, both kind of in very niche moments and then kind of more broadly, attorneys have viewed as a good option given the kind of uncertain nature of parole, the uncertain future of parole, and how administration by administration has wide leeway on deciding how it's going to respect parole that's been previously granted. So back to your original question, sorry for the detour, but it's kind of a combination. The largest, from what I had seen from data looking up earlier, like one of the most common classes of admission is OAR, Operation Allies Refuge parole, folks who came during the evacuation. It's folks who've applied for asylum, it's folks who've applied for SIV, and their respective dependent children, like the classes of admission. Mm-hmm. So overwhelmingly, it's really hard to tell the Venn diagram of who is parole, who's applied for TPS, who's applied for asylum, who has a pending SIV, application. Like the Venn diagrams in this space, as Sonia can attest, and you could attest too, are very confusing. Yeah. It's just really difficult to get a sense of how the overlaps work. But we do know that from the data we have that TPS has been a valuable tool for the parolee population as well as those who arrived after.
Sonia, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll also just add like some of the much smaller in numbers, but folks that I think a lot of people like that I've gotten questions about, like what is their status, is like thinking about people who were already here also during the withdrawal because things developed so rapidly. Fulbright scholars, students, people who came here with the intention of going back and then it became extremely unsafe to do that. TPS is a critical temporary protection to extend like so that someone doesn't have to stay in school in order to stay safe forever. Mm-hmm. And it's like TPS is critical for those folks, and just definitely foot stomping what Daniel said about people who are facing gaps in other protection because of the U.S. government, because of the situation, and the failures of Congress and previous administrations to really have steady and well-established infrastructure to process people and get them into a permanent position or keep them safe otherwise. Like TPS is key to kind of filling those gaps and making sure that we're not sending people and their families back to face the deadly retribution we know they would face in Afghanistan under the current situation.
Sure. Let's, not to freak people out even more, but that parole re-extension, because this is where I've always gotten confused with TPS. I thought that TPS was something synonymous with the parole extension. So when does that parole extension renew for the people who didn't opt to go for TPS and opted to instead, take advantage of when they finally did re-extend parole, which from my understanding happened a little later than a lot of people wanted, but it did happen. and that should have been for another 2 years, correct? So when do we have to worry about that?
Yeah, so it's primarily for 2 years, but there is a variety in terms of the length of renewals that people got. So,
Oh, wow.
and Daniel, jump in here. This is definitely a piece, but like there's a big group coming up kind of this summer. But it is like there isn't one set deadline. The way that like TPS protections for folks will end May 20th, it's a little bit rolling. So each individual has a set time when their parole will expire, but there isn't like it's not all like, June X, Y, and Z. It's over for those parole folks, like that status. But that also is a piece of like there's limited legal services capacity. Like everyone, it's so much to add on top of rebuilding folks' lives, running local businesses, like being the excellent community members that Afghan allies have been and supporting, like really recovering and contributing to American prosperity, like the current administration really emphasizes. Like it's a lot to add on top of that, and so we want to make sure like TPS is also critical for making sure that people with those rolling deadlines don't fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that and it is tricky because they're both temporary. They both don't connect to a longer term status. They both get connected to work authorization. So they're both heavily like vested in the executive. Like TPS and parole are very similar, and so that I think is like totally justified. One thing that's helpful to know is that you can have TPS on top of a parole, an active grant of parole, and nor do they have implications for one another. So, the end of one doesn't, or receiving one status doesn't on its own affect the other status, and vice versa. Nor does the end of one status affect the other one. So it does matter, like the length and the records obviously that people have with their parole, with their arrival records. And then whatever communication they do have from USCIS. And I will say, just like with the question of like kind of the varying windows, I think no matter what, even if we were to receive a dramatic kind of reversal of like the decision making here and like the route that the administration appears to be going, it's still just a really kind of unfortunate cycle. Even the previous administration, which did tend to extend these protections, it typically didn't do so early. It would wait up until day 60 or day 61 to make the announcement. So even if you're extended, you're still kind of like waiting on bated breath to see what that decision is. And okay, your country has been redesignated. If you have something pending, how does it apply to your employment authorization document that you filed for but you haven't gotten yet? And so it creates all this fluidity for this population and a lot of uncertainty. And I think yesterday's news in the New York Times and what the administration chooses to do or not with an extension or not is gonna have very like kind of immediate consequences, both in just kind of the day-to-day uncertainty of what's going to happen, as Sonia mentioned, with like limited legal services capacity right now, and also just like immediately really dire consequences for employment too. We've seen with other parolee populations, employers might see kind of the headline of parole revoked for this population and kind of use that as a basis of like, we're not going to, keep that employee on board. There's also cases too when if you have something like, and again, I'm not an immigration attorney, but just speaking generally, there's some cases where if you have something pending but you have a receipt notice, your employment authorization document might have an expiry date that's in the past, but as long as you like under this specific Federal Register notice, it's considered extended. But employers might not follow that to the letter of the law, so it creates all these like specific circumstances where people are gonna fall out of work authorization. They're gonna have lapses in their work authorization. And it's gonna have real dire consequences, right, for families and the ability to kind of stay afloat and make sure that they're doing okay. So I think that's kind of the big other concern with this. Even if something were to be revisited or different. A different directive were to come out, then it's just created a huge amount of uncertainty and what could be irreversible changes based on whether people are still employed, you know.
Sure. I want to talk about something that I didn't mention this when I talked about what I was going to ask you guys, but it's coming to mind just because of all of these, all the folks that are coming out of the keyboard warriors, you know, the keyboard cowboys out there about, you know, well, they're Taliban infiltrators and all of this, and someone might hear this and think, well, if you couldn't get an SIV and you couldn't get asylum, why not? What's wrong with you? And maybe you should go back. Who has let's talk about who has TPS, why they still have it. And I'd like to talk about the vetting too, because we talk a lot on this podcast about the gold standard vetting that US RAP gets, and SIV, how you're getting a CI background check, you're getting a poly, like we're not just saying, come on in, guys. So what happens with TPS? Why don't we start with that? Like, is there vetting associated with that we can talk about here? Anybody, go ahead. Sonia, I see you're starting to.
I think it's like, to get back to I think the start of the question around like why TPS, why not, like why aren't these people going to asylum or more permanent pathways? And I think that's one of the core components of why TPS is important, is like there are a lot of people who really do want to go back and help rebuild when it's safe, and like obviously people can still do that when they get permanent status here, but pushing everyone into the asylum system who was paroled in and doesn't have SIV eligibility, whether that's for documentation issues or whatever, like once you're already here, they can't be admitted through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And so if TPS isn't a protection and parole isn't a protection, people can go to asylum for a permanent pathway, but that is like putting it through permanent. And I think also on the concerns around like, well, why are we bringing people, like who do we know, what do we know about these people who are getting TPS? Like we know that they are here. And this is them coming forward to get protected status because they acknowledge like it is not safe to go back home. And I think like Daniel talked about really well, to get work authorization so that they can contribute. They can not have to live in the shadows. This is people coming forward and being excellent community members and contributing to the United States because they have TPS that allows them to do that legally through a congressionally endorsed, created program that was intended for these extreme circumstances. It doesn't mean that someone can go out and commit crimes that anyone else in the States would also not be allowed to do. There are still consequences. But TPS is a way to allow people to really like contribute, bring their expertise, continue to learn, continue to work, without that like really devastating fear of being sent back if there are those lapses and things like that. It also especially is like for folks in the SIV pipeline, as like just that added layer, people who are pursuing permanent status are going through additional vetting programs through those permanent options. On top of the work authorization and continuing to do this, but like making sure that they're safe while they're doing that and going through that vetting, like allows that vetting to happen more effectively, I think, because like if there are these lapses like after May 20th when you don't know, when there's just like that protection not only not existing but being taken away, what does that then look like to like go into a check-in for the other, like go in for an interview? But really, like, I think can't emphasize enough that TPS is designed to be temporary. It's designed to help people contribute and be a part of the community while they're here temporarily until it is safe for them to return.
Sure. Daniel, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just add to Sonia's point, you know, what we do know about this population, you know, never mind the processing that they received, you know, during the NEO, you know, on the lily pads, on the safe havens, through a re-parole process, through a parole extension process, the fact that they've also been applying for asylum or chief of mission or an adjustment of status based on SIV, and then separately on top of that, they are once again filing the form with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, coming forward. What to me, just from like, to be kind of like candid and less from a policy perspective, it's kind of reiterating a population that's really like trying to like follow along the rules. They're like paying really a close attention to their expiry dates. They're paying really close attention to the the like windows of validity that apply to themselves and their family. And I think that's certainly borne out in the classes of admission that we see with the TPS population, which includes people approved for asylum. It includes people who've, children of asylees or asylum applicants, SIV folks too. So I think both with applying for TPS and then after the fact also applying for an employment authorization document with USCIS, these are folks who are voluntarily coming forward to USCIS, presenting information related to their case to receive this immigration benefit. So to me, it's like really indicative of a population that's like coloring in between the lines, like following the rules, trying to stay on the up and up, and remain in status and remain in good standing. So I had another thought, but I'll probably include it there.
Oh no, if you want to.
No, I lost it. So.
Okay. Well, if it comes back, just tell me. That happens to me at like the most inopportune times. So let's talk about what happens next, because I've seen, and I might be conflating the letter that went out to everyone who used CBP-1 after it came out, which, gosh, it's so funny because I remember advocates being so angry about CBP-1 because then you couldn't use anything else to try to get asylum at the border. You had to use CBP-1, which of course had no DARI and no Pashto and no whatever. And now CBP-1 is gone. And it's kind of like Uniting for Ukraine. I was so angry about Uniting for Ukraine, not because they were helping Ukrainians, but because they would not do the same thing for Afghans, right? Like, let's make it really easy. Zoop. And then when Uniting for Ukrainians went away, or Ukraine, it's like, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for ever being angry about it. Anyway, that little aside to say, everyone who came in on CBP-1 has received a letter saying, you must now go, you're not wanted here, get out of here within 7 days, I believe is what that letter said. Is that the same thing that was sent to TPS folks, or did they get a different kind of letter?
No, so, I mean, frankly, I haven't seen the communications that have gone out related to TPS yet.
Okay.
But it is a distinct, development for folks. So with everyone for Afghans who were paroled, admitted to the U.S. through the legal process facilitated by CBP-1, that is, across the board, all on the same timeline, 7 days, because their parole is being terminated. And those are a lot of folks where TPS is a sort of protection and is critical. So we watch parole be taken away from that population. And then on top of that, now TPS, I think, is really threatening to people who, again, it is not safe for them to be sent back to Afghanistan without a really substantial reason. But there's a longer, I think, timeline for folks who still have TPS authorization through May 20th, because unlike the parole decision where it cut off parole immediately for those, or on a very tight timeline, the TPS decision is that eligibility and that designation for Afghanistan is not going to be extended, rather than on March 21st, when Secretary Noem, in theory, the statement says, made this decision, that wasn't the date that it cut off protections for everyone. Mm-hmm. That's a little bit further out.
So they have until May, but what about work authorization? I've heard that might go away before then, what does the next 2 months look like for our Afghan allies who have TPS?
So I think it'll also it'll depend on a number of different things. It'll largely depend on the individual circumstance that folks have, and whether or not they, particularly the work authorization front, whether or not folks have access to work authorization through another status or another route. So for example, you can hold employment authorization based on multiple different things. You can be employment authorized relevant to your TPS. You can also be employment authorized relevant to your parole, under OAW parole. You can be employment authorized if you file an asylum application and it's been enough time under current kind of policy. So it kind of depends on the individual circumstances for folks. So people might actually have, whether it's with parole or whether what other things they have pending with USCIS that they might that might affect, or that'll have ramifications for their status, their standing, their employment authorization. And I'll also reiterate Sonia's point too of like, because of how early it is, right now at this point we only have communication from DHS to the New York Times about this was the decision that was reached. We don't have a formal, from what I've seen, a formal news release on the DHS website about this decision. More critically, we don't have a Federal Register notice, because traditionally when these decisions are reached, the Federal Register notices on designations and extensions and redesignations, they have all the very like nitty-gritty information about, okay, your employment card tied to this date or tied to this status is valid through this point, and if you had sent it in before this date, it has all the like specific information relevant to your status, to your employment authorization, who you need to mail the fee waiver request to, that sort of information. And theoretically, like there's supposed to be some sort of like wind down too, which is partially why statute talks about and has a 60-day deadline. So until we see a Federal Register notice, it's kind of difficult to know what exactly we're the advocacy community or the legal service community or the Afghan community is responding to per se. Mm-hmm. And then I will also say that the point to which whatever decision is kind of reached and like formally communicated, whether it's subject to lawsuits and how quickly those lawsuits are filed and what sort of relief might happen from that. That's been decently common in the TPS space in recent years. So the Trump administration got sued over TPS terminations for other countries, including a group of countries known as the Ramos country, Nepal, Sudan, El Salvador, a couple others, involved in a years-long litigation battle over whether those designations were improperly terminated. And so that involved kind of the twists and turns of a lawsuit. We've already seen the TPS Venezuela termination subject to a lawsuit, subject to a court weighing in and trying to block the administration moving forward on that. So that'll be also something to watch, and whether that kind of keeps the status in place a little longer. Although I will caution that that's still going to be incredibly stressful and uncertain for populations, even if they're getting good news of a court staying in order or the government backtracking. It's still just going to involve the twists and turns similar to the Pasito case with the refugee program that are just going to be day in and day out, week in and week out. That's going to be difficult for people to keep up with.
Sure.
And like all of these overlapping components and the confusion and how individual each piece will be, even once we actually have the information that Daniel's talking about through a Federal Register notice, like, can't reiterate enough that, like, at least for me, like, I'm not an immigration attorney, and if someone is thinking about making a like big life decision around this news, would strongly encourage folks to talk to an actual immigration lawyer. If possible, like through community resources, through local organizations, like talk to an expert before making a decision, like a significant decision, like I think a lot of people may be thinking about with this news. Because it is, I mean, I can only imagine the stress and the anxiety from this and the target that a decision like this puts on this population. And so really just encourage people to talk to an expert before, like, about your specific circumstances.
Sure. I'd love to, and I know you just said that, but I'm going to ask you a specific question anyway, and you can tell me that you don't know the answer, and that's totally fine. But let's say that you are an Afghan who only has TPS right now. You haven't filed an asylum application. You don't have an SIV underway. What could, if you went to attempt to get asylum now, do you think that that would help you? Or if you were in the asylum pipeline, or if you were in the SIV pipeline, those three possibilities, would you still be subject to returning if you had something underway?
So in theory, there are protections for people who are in processing for these permanent statuses, especially like I think about asylum. And so for folks who haven't, like, again, not an immigration attorney, I think it's really, I'm not in a good spot to speak specifically to cases or how judges or USCIS officers are going to be considering this. That said, it, like, having the additional protection, pursuing permanent status, like filing those applications is, I think, a good idea. Yeah. Especially for people who haven't, like, if people haven't filed so far, like, file for asylum or file for your SIV, like, And everyone knows their circumstance better than I do. There isn't one like prescription across the board, at least that I'm in a good position to like securely give, but filing for that, like filing for permanent status to make sure that people are starting to move towards that well ahead of that May 20th deadline, or whenever someone's individual protections start to be impacted. And as we get the information from the Federal Register, it's easier to say a specific timeline there, but like, yes, making sure that people are not pushing up until it, like, making sure that people don't accrue time without some sort of legal status in the States is incredibly important, and is incredibly important for asylum or SIV cases moving forward.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, like, there are so many immigration attorneys who it seems like they're so bogged down right now. So earlier is better, because I've got people who, are in very dire situations and their lawyers can't get back to them because they have 20 other dire situations. So, sorry, Daniel, I know you were about to say something, so please do.
Yeah, I would just add on the question of like, because I think when TPS is good, because TPS talks about protection from removal, and I think that's obviously the idea of protection and deportation is a really scary topic right now, particularly for this population, particularly with Afghanistan. We're not, because it's such a fluid environment related to the return of foreign nationals, as we're seeing with Venezuelans and El Salvador, there's a current dispute over the return of South Sudanese nationals back to South Sudan that prompted a larger travel ban of South Sudanese passport holders. So, the issue of return of nationals, it strays into the realm of like foreign affairs and foreign policy, and that'll obviously depend on kind of like, as you kind of alluded to, like pretty early on when we were talking about relations with the Taliban and the idea of like, would they even accept returns, and if not them, then who and what other countries? But no matter what, that gets into a conversation that we in this community believe should not be happening at all, whether it's to Afghanistan or elsewhere, just to start there. So I'll just kind of add that point on kind of the issue of returns. And then, on the issue of what folks should be doing, I mean, as Sonia said, and unfortunately as we've kind of repeated over and over again, that we're not immigration attorneys and how everything depends on one's circumstances. But I mean, there's just still, good practices of keeping everything, whether it's your I-94 arrival record, any receipts, any communications you get from USCIS, receipts of things being received by USCIS, like that's helpful to maintain. The Federal Register notice of the current designation is available online. I could pull up the executive order number if that's helpful. Keeping that on hand. Generally, avoiding international travel, I think, has been a key recommendation from pretty much anyone who has a temporary status here in the United States. I think that's been the advice going back at least several months. So I think that remains relevant, and just staying as best updated as you can, which is, I know, a difficult task with how quickly things are changing.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned I was just looking at the DOA agreement the other day, and I'm looking at it again right now because I want to make sure that I'm not totally crazy here. I'm fairly certain that there is a line in here about returns, and that they have to allow people to return to the country. If I am wrong about that, then I will absolutely add that to the show notes or excise this portion. But the funny thing is, has the Taliban adhered to any of the DOA agreement? They're not allowed to train or house Al-Qaeda, its affiliates, and other international terrorists and individuals. And according to the UN monitoring team, they not only allow Al-Qaeda to train people in the country, but they are giving their Taliban intelligence personnel are like securing Al-Qaeda people, giving them security inside of Afghanistan. So the idea that, they said they would do this, the Taliban don't do what they say. One final question for you guys, because when I talked to Andy Sullivan, one of my favorite people ever, about the SIV program recently, and you guys at No One Left Behind, Sonia, going to Qatar and Albania to bring Now it's up to 1,000 Afghans who had SIVs in hand. These are not unvetted people. These are fully vetted people who are just waiting on transportation, and you all raise the funds to bring them here, and that's amazing. But he talked about how dangerous it is if they go back, if they have an SIV foil in their passport, and they have to go back through Taliban security, and the Taliban see that. I mean, that is straight up here, target is right here on my chest. Is there anything that a TPS holder possesses that if they were to return to Afghanistan would immediately notify the Taliban that I was in America, I was in processing for something? I mean, is there anything that would be that glaring, come get me, throw me in your prison, torture me notice to the Taliban?
Daniel, I defer to you if you know better, but my understanding is, like, certainly folks would have their passport stamps from having entered the States. Like, there's a record of them having been here. And so, like, for SIVs, it is glued into your passport, like, that you've been approved and certified by the U.S., that you had that military connection. For folks with TPS, like, they would be being returned from having lived in the United States, which underscores that they either fled or they were studying here and they chose to stay with temporary protected status. And, like, that is not an endorsement of the current government that would make anyone safer. Like, that is a huge red flag for folks. And that processing, like, just by virtue of having been here, there are photos, there's your social media, like, there are so many ways that people can be targeted for having lived in the United States for a significant amount of time now, whether that's source of employment, like source of income, kids going to schools. Like, it's incredibly dangerous for these people to be returned to Afghanistan without a reason.
Daniel, anything to add?
Yeah, I don't think so. To Sonia's point, I think there will be, like, a number of other different things before kind of the approval of the form that folks filled out with USCIS. So it'd probably be like third or fourth order in terms of things. I think the passport issue is probably more relevant, but I don't have much to add.
Okay. Well, I'd love to give you guys each a chance to say anything I didn't ask about, anything you want listeners to know before we sign out here. Daniel, I'll start with you.
I think we covered quite a bit. I would just encourage for folks who are in the United States to reach out to their members of Congress to continue being active on these sorts of issues. Sonia and I frequently talk with offices and have been for I guess in Sonia's case months, because I know Sonia was on the other side of the calls previously. Almost a year. I've been doing it years at this point. And it does matter when offices hear from constituents and how this issue affects, as I think Sean likes to say, a huge cross-section of American society cares about this and wants to see, see protections and pathways for Afghans protected. I think we need that sort of pressure to ensure that something like this isn't just left at the prerogative of the executive branch, which I know is what maybe members of Congress might kind of default to. The fact is, Congress created TPS in statute. It's a statutory thing. Afghanistan clearly meets the requirements. So I encourage folks to reach out to their members of Congress to be publicly or privately, for their members to publicly or privately engage with the administration on revisiting this decision, revisiting the potential, revocation of paroles that have occurred for Afghans, and encourage their members to look out for opportunities to support this population and other legislation, whether it's authorizing more Afghan special immigrant visas, which are going to be critical this year, whether it's supporting a reintroduced Afghan Adjustment Act, which would have avoided all of this 2+ years ago, or continuing to express support for Enduring Welcome and the Coordinator for Afghan Relocation Efforts. Looking for ways that, because this is one area where there's bipartisan support. We know we can get traction on it, and it's it's important for people to remain engaged right now. So I'd probably leave it there. And thanks for having me, despite my allergies and sniffles. And I'm a longtime listener, and of course the invite comes when I'm like recovering from whatever. Appreciate it.
You know that no one would have known that if you didn't just say it right now. No one would have known. That cracks me up. Oh my goodness. You were perfectly. I was there though.
Until the last minute.
Yeah, that's so funny. Sonia, how about you? Any final words, thoughts?
Yeah, I think for folks who are impacted by this, to like absolutely seek legal counsel, talk to an actual immigration attorney before making big decisions, like, and to know how many people are reaching out, like privately, publicly, talking to the administration, talking to members of Congress, and really are alarmed by this decision and don't agree that it is safe to return people or that we should be removing any layer of protection right now. And for folks who are American citizens or have extended status and are looking for ways to help the community, like Daniel said, absolutely, your members of Congress are keeping trackers of what are the topics that constituents are reaching out about, what are their positions. And so even just, and I encourage folks to keep it clear and polite. They're facing thousands and thousands of calls every single day, and so making sure that this is one of those issues with a 30-second call or writing into your member, hi, this is who I am, this is where I am in your district, and this is why I support TPS and other protections like the Afghan Adjustment Act, like Afghan SIV authorizations. And that's it. If they have more questions, great. If you want a response, ask. I would like a written response on your position or on the member's position. And that's it. And getting those numbers in is really important, especially as we think about Republican members who are in a really tough spot here, who this is a bipartisan issue. People are supportive. And the world has changed a lot in the last few months with the change in administration. And that backup from constituents to say, I, in whatever district, want you to act on this. I want you to say something. I want you to reach out to the administration or partners. Is really important for people to be able to do that. So reaching out to your members, reaching out to the White House, and making your voice known. There's also, I mean, I think about a lot of news coverage coming out, like this podcast, but like write a letter to the editor, write an op-ed in your local paper, because that will show up in members' clips. They do want to see what they're being mentioned in, what their constituents are talking about, and so like use your voice to show people. And I think really keeping it clear, this is a national security priority population. Like this is a bipartisan issue. Like it doesn't have to be for people who support the president or are nonpartisan, don't want to identify with one piece. Like it is still totally fair to share why you support this population and why TPS is important. And keep asking questions. I think I also really appreciate how many people have been willing to share the confusion of what is humanitarian parole versus what is TPS. Like understanding is also really important, and so like a huge shout out to everyone who's reading and listening and like tuning in to know what's happening so that they can be more effective in that outreach.
Yeah, you know, I think someone was talking to me in the advocacy community about writing op-eds and, you know, looking in East Coast, you know, very big things. And I thought at that time, no, we really need to go throw op-eds everywhere. And I'm serious, man. If I get like 5 people commenting on this podcast saying, I want to write an op-ed, I will freaking host an op-ed seminar, because that's how I cut my teeth on writing. I mean, I wouldn't be writing for Fox News if I had not started in op-eds.
Yeah.
They're very simple. It's a very easy thing to do, and if you know Afghans and care for them, it's a very moving way to make a difference. So yeah, anybody wants that.
Come talk to No One Left Behind has a program, Partners in the Promise, that people can check out at nooneleft.org. But
cool.
To provide some of that resource of like scripts for people about kind of the topic of the day, so that people are hearing those numbers that make it on the top of a member's chart, and to provide that support, because it is so important. And like members want to hear from you, even if they're a little bit exasperated with the numbers right now. And it is helpful, and it's also like it can be really scary. And so providing the, like, breaking down some of those barriers is so important. So yes, I will join your op-ed writing class. And
Cool,
then
man.
talk with Partners in Promise for that also.
Oh, I would love to do that. I would it makes such a difference when you can take a human story, pair it with numbers, and explain why, especially in this topic. It is something that, Sean, as Sean always says, it unites a wide spectrum of people. And that's what I've loved about it. And I feel like that is being pushed to the side now by a lot of really loud voices that are not motivated by fact. So, which leads me to tell everybody to tune in next week, because there's a good one coming, I think, anyway, I won't even say anything. So, thank you guys so much. I learned a lot, and I am not afraid to say, like, there are a lot of things I didn't know about, but I definitely feel like I understand this a lot more now, and I appreciate you illuminating this very convoluted and small thing into something that I think everybody can understand it now. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you for having the space for it and having the conversation. That's so important. So thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, happy to.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to the inverted paragraph anecdotal lead seminar.
Oh my God, no, I'm sorry, Daniel's running it. I just decided that, but you're running it. That's it. Yeah, that's right, because you're the journalist too. So like you actually see, that's the thing is I did op-eds first, journalism later, and I had to learn that it's a very big difference. But yeah,
I did journalism first,
and then advocacy. We have opposite career paths, but they crossed at some point. So,
yes.
And they're both valuable and fun. And once you learn how to do one thing, you can take on other things, and they just make you a better writer all around. So thank you all who are listening out there. I want to once again tell Afghan listeners, no matter where you are, no matter what part of your story you want to share, I want to hear it, and I really want your voices on this podcast. So please send your letters to the Afghanistan Project podcast at gmail.com. I will read them. I will give you anonymity, and everyone can, I think, understand and empathize better with the Afghan experience through your voices. Thank you again, Sonia and Daniel. Thank you to all the listeners for sharing your time, for supporting the people of Afghanistan, and for now, Tasha Kaur, and hope to see you again soon.